Erev Tov to everybody. Good evening. Um, we're moving into a different topic as we approach Rosh Hashanah, which is only now 6 weeks away. Gulp, says the rabbi. Um, it's an appropriate time to begin to think about the holiday. But I wanted to, I really thought I would teach about Rosh Hashanah in a different way. And being that I love history, not to mention the idea of time machines, that I thought maybe we would create our own time machine and go back and visit the Jewish world or a particular place in the Jewish world on on a particular date of Rosh Hashanah, and we would look at events in a few different ways. Number one, we would explore how Rosh Hashanah was celebrated or not celebrated at that particular uh, date and time in that era. Much of what we do now and take for granted didn't spring full blown, from the first observance of Rosh Hashanah. It was a layered, almost like a layer cake, a kind of an archaeological dig. You'll see that different layers were superimposed upon one another. So the idea of tashlich came into being. I don't want to give too much away, but tashlich came into being at a certain point in history, but not before. The idea of eating special foods on Rosh Hashanah, an apple and honey, and some of the various traditional foods, because depending where you are in the Jewish world, they're not all the same. All of those had specific points of origin. Different parts of the liturgy. Even the idea that Rosh Hashanah is a quote unquote new year had a specific genesis in time. In the days of the Torah, there was nothing called Rosh Hashanah. The holiday that we know today as Rosh Hashanah is biblical in origin. It's in the Torah, but it's known as Yom Truah or Yom Zichron Truah, the day of the blowing of the Truah, or a day of remembrance of the blowing of the Truah of the shofar. So all of these things were developments and accretions in time, one on top of the other. So in each of our sessions, we're going to look at how in that era Rosh Hashanah was celebrated. We're also going to look and see what was going on in the Jewish world. Right? What were people concerned about? What important events? What important rabbis? What important leaders? What were they talking about, thinking about? In short, what was on people's minds Jewishly? And then we're going to take a look at what was going on in the world at large. What were the current events of the year 800? What were the technologies, any recent inventions or things that people were talking about or excited about, or so a little bit of each of all of those. And to do this in the same way that one experiences living history. So the idea is that you get out of the time machine and you are actually seeing it in the first person. I can't promise any costumes. I haven't ruled it out either, but we'll have to see about that. There are certain eras that I wouldn't begin to know how individuals were dressed. But we'll see what what my research reveals. So what I wanted to do tonight is to actually set the table, and for us to go back to the year 0, because for us to understand the different iterations of Rosh Hashanah, we have to understand, how the Jewish calendar works and why in this year we are preparing to celebrate 5781. What is it? 5781 years since, right? We know that we are living with a secular calendar that tells us it's 2020. 2020 since the birth of Jesus. Probably not exactly, relatively, but not necessarily, within an exact year. But okay, it's 2020, and that's all there is to it. If we were Muslim, we would have a different calendar that would be dated from the beginning of Muhammad's vocation as a prophet. So depending on who we are, we use different calendars. As Jews, we live very much with one foot in the year 2020, with the other in the year 5780. Same is true in Israel, because Israel, to conduct its commerce, its diplomatic business, it has to have a context in which it can relate to the rest of the world. So for all secular purposes, the Israeli government uses the civil date. Although for ceremonial purposes, it obviously uses the Hebrew date and the Hebrew year. So if you do a little bit of calculation, the year 0 on the Jewish calendar was 3761 BCE, right, before the Christian era. So the reason that we have 5780, almost 5781 as the Jewish year is because of a fellow named Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta. He was a student of Rabbi Akiva, and he authored a work called Seder Olam Rabbah. Not to be confused, there's another midrashic work from a later period, Seder Olam Zuta, but this is Seder Olam Rabbah. And it is a work of chronology, listing not only various important dates in the history of the world from a Jewish perspective, but also dates relative to one another in the lives of our major biblical figures. So, for example, he discusses the age of Isaac at the time of the Akedah. So if it has to do with chronology, you're likely to find it in Seder Olam Rabbah. Now, do we have some original manuscript that's written in Yossi Bar Chalafta's hand? No. In fact, in the form that we have it, it probably is, it dates from about 100 years later, sometime in the 3rd century. But it's certainly not inconceivable that it was written by Yossi Bar Chalafta, for the simple reason that we know it was authored around the mid to late 2nd century BCE. Let me take a step back for a moment. There's nowhere in the Torah that dates in some objective fashion are given. The Torah does not know from a year 0. Torah will tell us that this, ancient, hoary-headed figure lived to be 690, and then he had begats. And if he liked bagels and breads, maybe he had baguettes, as opposed to just begats. And then he lived an additional X number of years, and then he died. In the 130th year after the Exodus, ... in the 4th year of the kingship of so-and-so, in David's 7th year as king. So there are lots of chronologies, but they are all relative to a particular point in time, not to the same point in time. Right? So they're not dated from quote unquote a year zero. So reading through the Torah, reading through the Tanakh, you get a sense that there is a flow of time and a flow to history. But what you don't get is some sense of dating, that it all starts here and you can measure distance from that starting point. That really doesn't happen until much later. So Rabbi Yossi ben Chalafta, in creating this chronology, he uses the Tanakh only, right? He's not a fan of carbon dating because it doesn't exist. He isn't a fan of archaeology or geology. It doesn't exist, right? So the fact that he has no idea about the likelihood that the Earth is billions of years old is really not his problem. What's interesting is to see the way that Jews religiously navigate this dilemma. For the most part, it's not a dilemma. Christian fundamentalists have a much bigger problem. Why? Because for us as Jews, we can live on two different parallel planets or two different tracks, and that our understanding of time religiously is completely separate and apart, compartmentalized from our understanding of time through the lens of science. I can't tell you that there are no Jews who do not believe that the world was literally created only 5,780 years ago, and that all of this stuff about fossils and dinosaurs can somehow be proven, disproven, or maybe God put them on the face of the earth to fool us. But it really is not a Jewish problem. It's been something of a fundamentalist problem, because if you are literally locked into the meaning of the simple reading of the text, and that is your only tool for religious understanding, you have to deny science. What's interesting is that for Jews in the age of Yossi bar Chalafta, and even for about 1,000 years afterwards, his work was used for exegetical purposes only. Jews didn't use the dating system that exists in Seder Olam Rabbah. Right? In the time of the Talmud, when Jews wanted to refer to the year, they actually, which really, was of greater importance in their business lives and their correspondence with government officials, they used the the dating scheme of the larger society under whose authority they live. In the Greek era, there were years that were based on, the era of contracts, it was called. That certain specific things were for particular periods of time, depending on where you lived, whether you were under Parthian rule or Roman rule. You also dated things by the year in the third year of the reign of Domitian, or Marcus Aurelius, or whoever it might have been. But internally, Jews didn't, particularly think about these things. Now, it may seem hard to us today, but keep in mind that in antiquity, the conception of time was very different. There were no chronometers. I mean, there were ways with sundials, and we have a sense of time and its exactitude, and the need for these objective, universal systems of dating things from some objective point that our ancestors didn't see a need for. I often like to point out that what we take for granted as time zones and have only been around for 130 years or so. They didn't come into being until the heyday of rail travel, when trains had to create schedules across time zones. So every town had its own time. And the fact that a clock in New Harmony, Indiana, and another one in Gary didn't tell the same time really didn't matter. So what we accept now as just a necessity didn't exist 2,000 years ago. So it was left to Maimonides, to the Rambam, in the 12th century, right about 1,000 years after Seder Olam Rabbah, to really fully flesh out the parameters of the system and make the dating that we call the Jewish calendar pretty universal throughout the Jewish world. So from the time of Rambam on, the Jewish year becomes the way in which Jews communicate with other Jews. And it really doesn't matter, as to the authenticity, the veracity of what that beginning point is. It matters far more that it's the Jewish year. So where 5780 comes from is far less important for Jews than the fact that it's 5780 for us as Jews. So in the Mishnah Torah, Rambam writes that all calculations of dates should be based. He starts it for him on the third day of Nisan in the present year, 4938 was his present year, which corresponded to March 22nd, 1178 CE. So he kind of creates the, okay, on your mark, get ready, set, go. And Rambam's stature is such that, within a generation, Jews are using the calculation. Sometimes, by the way, in English, you'll see AM, right? We know BC is before Christ, or AD is Anno Domini, and Jews don't really like that so much. So we say BCE, before the Christian era or before the Common Era. and instead of AD, right, Anno Domini in the year of our Lord, we say CE, right, Common Era or Christian Era. But you'll often see AM when the Jewish date is given using English letters. So what's AM? Anno Mundi, in the year of the world, right? Referring to Briat Olam, in the year of the world, Anno Mundi. Which sounds like it could be a really good Italian dessert. I'll have the Anno Mundi, please, without the cream. So you know, it is that system that remains in place today, not only for calculating the Hebrew year, but also for coordinating it with the lunar cycle that determines the month. So Rambam sort of kind of just put everything, that would be the that date, 3rd of Nisan, 4938, corresponding to March 22nd, 1178. And I'm assuming that he was using the old Julian calendar, because the Gregorian calendar wasn't yet common in Europe, and would not be for I think a couple hundred years. The Julian calendar is 11 days behind the Gregorian calendar. In any event, so as far as Rambam is concerned, the beginning of creation was in the Hebrew year 0. Okay? And the creation of human beings was in the Hebrew year 1. All right, so the rabbis teach that the world was created on the 25th of Elul. When are human beings created? The 1st of Tishrei. 6 days later, right? We don't come around till the 6th day. In Seder Olam Rabbah, the world is created in the year 1, and humanity is created in the dawn of the year 2. So you have, for the most of year 1, tohu vavohu, just chaos. On the 25th of Elul in that year, God begins the process of creation. And on Rosh Hashanah, God completes the process of creation through the making of first man and woman. Clearly, this is all rabbinic, because there's no dating of the creation story in that way, right? We have something called first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, sixth day, Shabbat, you know, which some argue shouldn't be understood as 24-hour days, right? The sun and the moon aren't even created until the 4th day. So, you know, what's a day? Measured how? But leaving that aside, Rambam differs with Seder Olam Rabbah by a year. So it's either 3760 or 3761 in which the world is created. You can take your choice.
13.
What?
13 participants.
113?
13.
Oh, 13.
13, yes. I'm going to do that. Okay. So, a couple of notes on the chronology, and then maybe we'll talk a little bit about what was going on in 3761 BCE, as far as we know. So Abraham is not born until the year 1946. Not CE. All right, Abraham is not one of the early baby boomers. 1946 BCE would correspond to, 1946 Ano Mundi, or Livriata Olam in Hebrew, would in our scheme, our secular scheme, civil scheme, would be 1815 BCE. Okay, so 1815 before the Christian era. Now, how would you write that in Hebrew? Right. So this is a good place to talk about. And if you have a little pen or piece of paper, and you want to, and you're comfortable with Hebrew numbers, and you want to just see what it looks like. So 57. Let's start with the year that we're in, 5780. Remember that Hebrew letters have numerical values. So we don't often, we don't write the numbers out traditionally with Arabic numerals. I mean, we can, but Jews didn't use that until considerably later. They used letters, rather, the same way that Romans do, or did. So it gets a little bit complicated because when we write the year 5780, 5780, we do not write the Hebrew letter for 5,000. It's implied, it's understood. Sometimes you will see a hey with a little chichik, sort of a backward apostrophe. So the letter hey with a little apostrophe, and then set apart from that the rest of the Hebrew date. But traditionally, I guess because when you get into the thousands, it doesn't change very often. For the most part, the thousandth is just understood and not written. So if you were looking to see how this year is written in Hebrew letters, it would be Taf, Shin, Pei. Just those three letters, Taf, Shin, Pei. Taf is 400, Shin is 300, and Pei is 80. So that's 780. Or if you throw in that hey that we left over on the side, 5,780. So the schematic of Hebrew numbers, nothing goes above 400. Taf is the highest value. So anytime you get into a numerical value greater than Taf, you have to use a combination of other letters to get you where you need to go. Okay, so the year of Abraham's birth would have been, understand the Aleph, it's just a given. It would have been an Aleph with that little chichik, meaning the year, 1000 plus. But it would have been written as Taf, Taf, Kuf, Mem, Vav. Taf, 400, Taf, 400, Kuf, 100, that equals 900, Mem, 40, Vav, 6. So it was the year 400 plus 400 plus 100 plus 40 plus 6. So, maybe not always the easiest way of representing numbers, especially if you get into, really high numbers. But the same is true of Roman numbers too, because if you ever look at at an inscription where it's L, X, 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 5, V, 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 1, 1, 5, you really have to sit there and add it all up. It's not, it's not the most convenient way of representing numbers. So the period between Abraham's, call at the age of 75 to leave his birthplace to go to the land of Canaan. So he's 75. And then if you wanted to, figure out by looking at the ages of the patriarchs, until Jacob gets into Egypt, it's 215 years. And then the period in Egypt is calculated as 430 years, although it gets a little dicey because there are some competing chronologies. God tells Abraham that his descendants will be there 400 years, not 430. Now, the rabbis have an explanation for that, you can imagine. And the genealogy of Moshe's family in Exodus chapter 6 only allows for 4 generations between Levi, Jacob's son, who goes down to Egypt, and Moshe. So it's Levi, Levi's son Kahat, Levi's grandson Amram, and then Moses is Levi's great-grandson. So if you play around with the length of generations, you can come up with 430. But again, this really is not about figuring out dates. It's about understanding the way in which our ancestors looked at this. Right, so the Exodus, by this calculation, takes place in the year 2666. Right, which would be Taf Resh Samech Vav, with the bet understood for the year 2000, and that would correspond to the year 1095 BCE. So these are all the various biblical chronologies. I think it's important to understand where it comes from because it's part of the literacy we should try to embrace as Jews. I don't have any, great urge to accept them literally. My understanding of Judaism and my love of Torah and the Tanakh aren't changed in any way. That being said, so let's just presuppose for a moment that it is the year 3761. So what's going on? 3761. What were you doing in 3761 BCE? Can you remember that far back? By the way, it's October 7th, the 25th of Elul. Now, the calendar wasn't fixed. That didn't happen until much, 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 much later. But, if we want to go with it and fix the calendar and retroject the date into that distant past, the 25th of Elul was 3761 BCE. So that was the date of creation. Right, so if you keep a journal, you might want to go back and see where you were on October 7th, 3761. I know exactly where I was. I was somewhere in Alpha Centauri. Anyway, so what's going on? Well, obviously, Jews don't exist. Abraham doesn't exist and won't for close to 2,000 years before the flood. So we can't talk about what Jews are doing because Jews don't exist, but human beings certainly do. So somewhere in that fourth millennium, and there's no way to date this with any precision, but in the fourth millennium BCE, that is from the year 4000 to the year 3001 BCE, the first plows come into use. The first planked roads using timber are laid in actually in Northern Europe. They're just really, to keep animals from sinking into the mud. They're just very rude planks that are laid over, they call them causeways, but I wouldn't, think of them in the modern sense as causeways. It's the late Chalcolithic era, which means folks were smelting copper. So from the late 5th millennium, somewhere from there into the late 4th millennium BCE, is where the Bronze Age starts. Right? Typically, the Bronze Age is dated to about 3300 BCE, the earliest Bronze Age. So what is bronze? Well, you got copper. They were using copper. Copper ore. They were able to get it out of rocks. They understood that. And we have artifacts with copper from that early period. But somehow somebody figured they were also smelting tin. So if you smelted tin and you smelted copper, and then you mixed the two, you took the molten tin and put it in with the copper, it actually made for a stronger metal than either the tin or the copper would separately, because both of them are very malleable, but bronze was much more durable and much harder. Who had this smart idea? His name is lost to history. Maybe it was Mr. Reese, same guy who came up with the chocolate and the peanut butter and putting them together. And I don't know if there was a Mr. Reese, maybe. But somebody came up with that. So this would have early use of experimenting with tin and copper to form bronze might very well have been going on in the year 3761. Other fantastic inventions of the fourth millennium: sails, not the kind that take place at Dillard's, but the kind that people put on boats. So the use of wind power rather than just oaring, rowing boats came around somewhere in this fourth millennium. Wheeled carts, that was a big one. And also pottery wheels. So the invention of the potter's wheel obviously allowed folks to make much more useful and durable goods and utensils, because, there was clay, but when you mush clay up together and then let it dry, it's not, it's not just an aesthetic thing, but its ability to be useful as, as a bowl or as some sort of drinking receptacle is much more limited. So potter wheels came into being. It was also the era of pictograms and very early writing, proto-writing. By the end of the fourth millennium, Sumerian cuneiform is fully developed. So writing on these clay tablets. So a lot of, stuff is going on. As far as language goes, the oldest Semitic language that we know of today is Akkadian. And that dates to about the 23rd century BCE. And we're talking now about 1400 years before that. So scholars talk about something that they call Proto-Semitic. Proto-Semitic was, the parent of all Semitic languages. It was a direct ancestor of Hebrew, and also Aramaic, and Akkadian, and Ugaritic, and ultimately Arabic, which is a little bit later. But all of these Semitic languages had an ancestor. Now, we don't have any writings. There's nothing out there we can point to and say, oh, yes, that was the first Proto-Semitic book. But what linguists do is to study all of these other ancient forms of Semitic language and look for common roots and root systems in each of them that they can trace back and, make a pretty good hypothesis about where they came from and what would be the most original. You look for those things that are universally found in all of these Semitic languages. So there's Proto-Semitic. There's a lot of debate about where these folks came from. Did they come from Africa? Did they come from other parts of Asia? We're really not sure. Now, sometime around this in the mid to late 4th millennium, Sumer in southern Mesopotamia is settled, right? Present day Iraq, southern Iraq. So the Sumerians come into being. And then the kingdom of Egypt, just a little bit later, kind of like around the very end of the millennium, around 3000, 3100, 3200, the kingdom of Egypt is established. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of what's going on. Our ancestors, monotheism, the promised land, none of that is extant yet in the year 3761 BCE. And not even camels. Camels weren't introduced to the Middle East until about the end of the 3rd millennium in 2000, 2300, 2400. So even camels were not around it's hard to imagine a Middle East without camels, but they weren't around. And they were around, they just weren't used yet in the Middle East. So that's where I was going to stop for tonight. There just isn't, a lot to say Jewishly about that time. Our next stop would be around the year 200 CE, and to talk a little bit about what would have been happening just around the time the Mishnah was being written down on paper, on parchment, was on paper. This is already after the destruction of the temple. So there'll be a lot more to talk about Jewishly come, Rosh Hashanah in the year 200 of the Common Era than the year 3761. So I'm going to unmute folks and, comments, questions. If you have any personal memories from October 7th, 3761, the year 0, or the year 1, depending on, I'd love to hear them. Michelle. You're raising your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I So how are we to understand what is notated as, like, on a certain day in Tishrei we celebrate this? Like, where did the definitions of the months come from that are noted in the Torah?
Well, in the Torah, actually, the names, for the most part, in the Torah, months are known simply by their ordinal. You know, in the first month, in the second month, in the 11th month. A little bit later in the Tanakh, you see that there are some Hebrew names, but the names we use now for the Hebrew months are in Hebrew. They're Babylonian. They came back with us after the first exile. So you won't see Tishrei or now in Megillat Esther, you do. You see, because that's, of course, after Jews, or at least some Jews, returned from the first exile, and those Babylonian names were already established. So the name of the month we call Adar is in Megillat Esther. The same for Nisan, or so in late biblical history, you'll start to see the names of months. But whether you call it the seventh month or Tishrei, it's the same thing, right? It's just a different name for the seventh month. The Torah simply says on the first day of the seventh month, you'll observe this holy convocation, Yom Mikra Kodesh. You shall not work. It should be a day of sacred truah, a day of, shofar blowing. So we just have names as opposed to, numbers, but still the same months. But that comes out of the Torah. Helen, did you have a question?
Yes. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could just remind me, because I think you said it, but I didn't get it. How did you come about to begin with the year 3761?
Oh, because if you do, all right, you just do some simple math. And if it's 2020 minus 5,780, right, that gives you minus 3761, or 3761 BCE.
So that's what I thought. So this, what you are reporting on, since I don't remember it, but apparently you do, happened before it didn't happen before the creation of the world. Did it happen before the creation of the world biblically?
That is the traditional date in Seder Olam Rabbah for the creation of the world. The year zero, or if you go with Rambam, the year one, is what we say, happened 5,780 years ago.
Okay.
And he's just basing himself on, what Rabbi Yossi Bar Chalafta, or the author of Seder Olam Rabbah, did, just by counting. I mean, basically, they didn't, he just, if you take that there's a year zero or year one that the world is created, and then you go through all of the genealogies and chronologies, and you go through, and this is I'm going to figure out the amount of time between God talking to Abraham and then Jacob going down to Egypt, and how long they were in Egypt, and then 40 years. And now I'm going to look at all of the chronologies of the judges, and go all the way through. You're able to. The Torah doesn't, or the Tanakh doesn't connect those dots in any way. But for somebody who wants to connect those dots in that way, they're connectable. There sometimes are some disputes about how to connect them. Right, so there may be one schematic that, schematic A comes up with a somewhat different chronology than schematic B, but either way, there's a way to connect all those dots. Other thoughts, questions? I'm curious if you could go back to any period, any year, any Rosh Hashanah of any year, what would it be? Have you ever thought about that? And I'm just using Rosh Hashanah.
1390. 1390 in
1990,
Spain.
okay.
1390 in Spain.
Oh, 1390.
1390 in Spain.
Okay. Why 1390? It's good you didn't say 1391, because a lot of tsuris happened to the Jews in 1391. I mean, even, 100 years before they were expelled. There were vast,
There were,
churches and conversions, forced
but I
conversions.
thought it was in 1390.
1391. So 1390, you're still okay.
Okay,
You
well,
don't want to be.
1390.
You want to be around for the Inquisition and the forced conversions?
Well, I want to know if my family left or not.
Okay. You might want to fast forward a little bit, but okay. And anybody else have a favorite a year they're curious about? If they could, you don't have to stay there.
Oh, good. Good.
I never thought about it, to tell you the truth.
Okay. Go ahead, Michelle. Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah. Like 30, and not BC, AD.
30.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. The Beit HaMikdash is still standing. The time of a lot of sectarianism. There's some unrest between Jews and Romans, but there's a Roman procurator. 30 is around the time, I think, of Caligula, who not the best of emperors. You're probably better off in Judea than in Rome. You're going to be around in the year 30. But a very interesting year. Rabban Gamliel is around. I would be curious, obviously, to see a lot of our sages. I'd love to meet Rabbi Akiva. I'd love to meet Hillel. So Hillel would have been the early years of the 1st century CE, or the very end of the 1st century BCE. I might choose that. Love to meet the Baal Shem Tov and spend a Rosh Hashanah with him, honor of Hasidism. So.
Oh yeah, yeah, that would be good.
That'd be a party.
It'd be unnerving, I think. The guy had a very penetrating. His emotional intelligence was through the roof. But anyway, so as we think about Rosh Hashanah, I think it gives us a really good window in seeing both the evolution of Judaism as well as the kinds of things that perhaps are not so different. I don't think our ancestors living even 2,000 years ago were so different than we are in some ways. And yet the life that they lived and the society in which they functioned was certainly very, very different. Well, so I suspect if we could build a time machine, we would be surprised by how similar our ancestors are, even as we would also be amazed at how different life is and how certain values that we take for granted might not really be, on the scene, and vice versa. So we'll call it a night, and I thank you for joining me and our time machine back to the year 0 in the Jewish calendar. And look forward next time. Let me see. Let me do my little math here. What year is it? I wrote it down. Okay, the year 3961. The year 3961, otherwise known as 200.